A presentation by Every Farthing Productions, Shadow, narrated by J. Edson.
Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the shadow side of human nature. I remember when I was a kid, I used to sit around the radio, and sit in front of the radio, and listen to Saturday night dramas, radio dramas, and one of them was The Shadow. And I remember the refrain that accompanied this show each time it came on, each Saturday evening, and it went something like this, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows. And then there would be this squeaking door. It was all very ominous, and it impressed me a great deal. I loved it. And the shadow, like most heroes in those days, was not a shadow figure himself, really. He, in fact, fought evil, like all of the heroes that children admired in those days, which you can't blame him for that. That's a good thing to do, I suppose. But the concept of the shadow as an unacknowledged aspect of the human psyche was developed by the psychologist Carl Jung, and he felt as though acknowledging and integrating the shadow in oneself was an important step toward spiritual, emotional wholeness and growth. It's important to realize that accepting it and acknowledging and integrating it doesn't necessarily mean acting on it in a direct way. In some cases it might, in some cases it might not. Consider, for example, the possibility that you might be really angry at your boss, and for some reason you don't want to acknowledge this. You're not the kind of person that has petty feelings like anger for being slighted by your boss. And so that self-concept of yourself as not a petty and angry person gets in the way of your accepting the fact that, in fact, you are quite angry at your boss and you'd like to punch him in the nose. These feelings in you are likely to be less manageable and more troublesome to you in various ways if you don't acknowledge them. If you simply say, yeah, he really ticks me off what he did, I would like to punch him in the nose, then obviously you'll think it over and probably come to the conclusion that's not the best way to deal with those feelings. But acknowledging them and dealing and integrating them into yourself is probably a good thing to do. That's a small example, but it would work like that, roughly speaking, on more serious issues, more significant issues as well. And so there was an interesting study that really explored this in an odd sort of way. In the study, they pulled together two groups of men, one of whom scored on some sort of a test that they gave as being strongly homophobic, and the other was not. And they presented both of these groups with stimuli that was homoerotic, and they had them put on a plethysmograph, which is something that measures the increase in penile circumference or sexual arousal, obviously is what they're concerned with. And what they found was rather interesting. And I'll just read kind of from the study. Only the homophobic men showed an increase in penile erection to male homosexual stimuli. The groups did not differ in aggression. Homophobia is apparently associated with homosexual arousal that the homophobic individual is either unaware of or denies. That was quite interesting. Actually, it's something I suspected for a long time. Fits right in with the Jungian perspective of how the psyche interacts with other people and with the society. So then I thought, well, if this is true of specifically homoerotic arousal, which presumably involved adult males, it seemed highly probable that the same kind of thing would be true of intergenerational sexual feelings. In other words, feelings about boys or girls. And so if we reread the study, suppose the study had been done on those groups of people and they had found similar results, then the study would have said pedophobia is apparently associated with pedophilic arousal that the pedophilic individual is either unaware of or denies. I think that's quite probable. I don't know of any studies that have dared to explore that hypothesis to test it out, but I think it's highly probable. Why would it be true in the case of arousal to adult men and not be true in terms of the arousal of younger males? So let's assume for a moment that it is true. I'm not claiming that it's proven, but it's highly plausible. Let's assume for a moment that it's true and think of a couple of the ramifications of this. Since we are in a panic about sex abuse of children, just a real moral panic about it, just obsessed with it as a culture and overreacting in all kinds of ways, that suggests that there is, in fact, some sort of a projection going on. What would explain the intensity of this coming along all at once? It came along, oddly enough, with a lot of sexual liberation in other areas. So people in general began to be aware of sexuality that previously they denied, and then they came up against this particular kind of desire and went into a panic about it. Would seem to be what happened. And they went into a collective panic. See, the shadow operates both on an individual and a collective level. On an individual level, we might go beat up somebody who's on the registry nearby, and that would be our way of projecting the shadow onto somebody else. Collectively, we pass laws and we obsess about it and we do all sorts of draconian things to people who have not necessarily done anything very serious. So it operates both on a collective and an individual level. And what would seem to be the case is that society is in a panic about discovering that a degree of erotic attraction normally exists between adults and minors. And I guess I would ask whether it might make sense to simply acknowledge this and then from there move on into a discussion about how then would it be best to manage these feelings both individually and collectively.